Okay. So welcome to the session on AI and neuroscience. I'm delighted to have some very distinguished guests here today. Just to sort of say what we'll be doing, I will make some introductions first of all, and then I'm going to be calling upon Refik Anadol to show some of his work, and then Anil Seth to talk about some of his ideas. And then we'll go into some discussion between us. So to start off then, Refik Anadol is somebody I think who's known to many people in the world of kind of AI and media art. He is from Turkey, like many of the kind of rock star media artists such as Memo Akten. He came across to LA in 2012, I think it was. And the story that I think most amazing was the fact that the first thing that Refik did was to go straight to the Walt Disney Concert Hall by Frank Gehry back in Istanbul. He'd been a big fan of Frank Gehry, and he came to see this building and saw it kind of, I guess, asleep at night. And since then, what is interesting about his work is he's tried to sort of bring life to architecture. So just to clarify, Refik is not an architect. He did study under Güvenç Özel briefly at UCLA, although he wasn't studying architecture. And yet architecture is somehow part of his world. He uses data from architecture, from buildings in particular, and he also projects onto buildings. So in other words, although not an architect, architecture is both his kind of material and also his canvas. And anyway, Refik is now, after studying at UCLA, has established his own practice, a thriving practice in LA, and the rest is history, shall we say. But he's had some remarkable clients and has been producing some remarkable work. Our other key guest today is Anil Seth. Anil Seth is probably known to more people, in fact, than Refik, in that he is a kind of rock star of the world of TED Talks. He has almost 10 million viewers on his amazing TED Talk. I show it every year in my lectures, and I think that every architect should have a look at some of his work, especially his thoughts on the term hallucination. Anil Seth was studied at the University of Cambridge initially, and is now at the University of Sussex, having spent some time in San Diego, which of course is a big center for neuroscience, also very famous, of course, for its architecture. And Kris, who is joining us, was working and teaching in San Diego, and is part of the ANFA, the Association for Neuroscience for Architecture. Anil Seth is at the moment at the University of Sussex, where he is part of a very interesting group, also with Andy Clark. Andy Clark was our keynote speaker at DigitalFUTURES in 2019, and they work on very similar ideas, predictive perception. But I also want to mention a third member of the team at the University of Sussex. That's Margaret Bowden, the grand old lady, as it were, of cognitive science. I think she set up the first ever cognitive science department in the world at the University of Sussex. And what is so interesting is that the ideas that she brought with her have come to fruition. What I would say is maybe that whereas a few years ago, the dominant discourse in terms of theoretical circles in architecture was continental philosophy, critical theory, comparative literature, now increasingly it's cognitive science. That group of kind of studies where neuroscience, AI, psychology, philosophy, and many other disciplines come together in a very dynamic way. Also joining us today is Daniel Bolojan. Daniel is currently an assistant professor. He just started the Florida Atlantic University in Fort Lauderdale. Prior to that, he was at Florida International University in Miami. Daniel was initially from Romania, and he studied initially at first of all, at Iomincu School of Architecture in Bucharest, before going to study Angevanta School, the very famous school in Vienna, where Wolf Prick, Zaha Hadid, Greg Lynn, and many others were teaching at the time. Since then, he's gone on to do a PhD on AI under Patrick Schumacher, also at the Angevanta, and has been one of the kind of rocks behind the whole Digital Futures World organization. Without Daniel, we could have done very much at all. Daniel automated the whole registration process and so on. And behind him, you'll see some of the work that he has done for Corp Himmelblau, where he's also been working as a consultant, the Deep Himmelblau project that Wolf Prix will be talking about also. So AI is very central to his life. He's not only teaching a workshop on AI in this particular workshop, he also has been doing some of the AI work for Corp Himmelblau, and has been working with Patrick on AI robots, I guess you call them, also for that sort of practice. Finally, Kris Mund, in a roundabout way. I mentioned Kris earlier. It's great to have Kris here. Kris has had a peripatetic career, studying initially in Michigan, in, what was the name of the school, sorry, Kris?
Cranbrook Academy of Art.
Cranbrook Academy of Art, before going across to Europe and working with Lars Spaybrook at Knox, and then taking on a PhD at the Architectural Association in London. She moved back to the States, first to USC, then to San Diego, and has been instrumental in establishing or setting up conferences at the interface between architecture and neuroscience. And that's in many ways where we are today. And I think that we're in a very extraordinary juncture in that this kind of interface hasn't happened before, and some remarkable things are happening. So I'm going to call upon Refik Anadol to show us some of his very inspirational work that he's been doing, where he has been hallucinating mainly architectural data and creating a kind of a media landscape, a mutating media landscape that has enthralled everyone around the world. So Refik, over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Again, so happy to be here this morning, especially Anil. I mean, today I'm trying to share a speculation about things that I think will be incredible to share all together. Daniel and Kris and Neil, thank you very much again for inviting. This is a very meaningful day. So today I would like to share my very humble journey and also just say hi to everyone again. I'm a media artist and director right now in Los Angeles. I'm teaching at UCLA Design Media Arts Department, where I got my second MFA degree in media arts. Today I will quickly try to explain my humble journey with the early findings as an artist and founding the studio, and finale is a mission intelligence and encounter with AI. I was born in Istanbul, Turkey. A city has an influence, I think, in my consciousness a lot. A city that where the left and right, black and white, contemporary and modern, and many extreme contrast spectrum feelings exist in the city. And I was so fortunate, I was 8 years old to watch the movie Blade Runner. I think it's a very cliche maybe for a child, but I think I was extremely inspired without knowing the language. I watched a flying car next to a beautiful Asian face in a media landscape of Los Angeles, 2019. And the same year, I got my first computer, which is very first time encounter the idea of a space in the mind of a machine, and learned that by typing a simple one word and enter, can enter into the world of machine and really obsessed with games. My first, I think, medium was photography as a means of architectural photography, and try to capture time and space, understand the abstraction of concept specifically in space. I think the big moment for me was as a student in my last year as an undergrad in design studies. I was the only student also responsible for running an exhibition, sorry, myself, for almost 6 months, every morning, opening and closing 300 media artworks, mostly notable artists such as Peter Weibel, Jeffrey Shaw, and many others. And ZKM, and it was my first mentorship to really understand to work with media arts. But I think the groundbreaking moment for me was this specific event in Berlin. As a student, I was just passing by and stopped in this event, and they were discussing the future of architecture. And they were saying embedding media arts into architecture was the idea of future media facades. But for me, Lev Manovich was giving an amazing lecture, and he was saying, if an artist and architect can collaborate, they can make this invisible world visible. And it was an inspiring day for me, because the idea was really what I'm doing, I think, today, making invisible visible, try to use architecture as a canvas, and most importantly, use light as a canvas, because I found that architecture is beyond glass, concrete, or metal. And I found that light can be an ultimate material that can transform in any form. And the beautiful thing, it can goes away. It doesn't harm or like make you like uncomfortable. It's not like an absolute physical experience. And also, I think I was super inspired by the reality itself, like where it starts, where it ends, for whom, but also like how the art itself is also contextually limited itself. And really research a lot on trompe-l'oeil, and especially understand like architectural context, and really understand how I can apply this idea to a building in Istanbul. On the left side, it's a concrete and a steel cube where it's is also used for contemporary art. And I transformed the building into like a moving canvas by using a one-channel projection back in 2009. And my journey started there, I guess. So the idea of embedding media arts into architecture, using light as a material, algorithmically transforming our perception of reality. So it just goes away in many, many scales. And luckily with Sana's Japanese architects, their building in Germany was my very first encounter with the idea of what architects dream and what they couldn't do because of the reality. And I tried to close the gap between what they say, what they want to say, but what they couldn't. And even that, later on, I was very fortunate to work with data in public space in 2011. It was my very first data sculpture, thanks to the city of Istanbul and the Biennale. I was able to work with parametric design and get the 3 days of sound recording of Istanbul, one of the most, I think, 3 million people in a weekend. The protest, the happiness, like the most happy and the most sad, maybe the most critical cities part, transformed into their memories, let's say sound memories, transformed into a 3-dimensional space. And there, sorry, I witnessed the power of actually algorithms, and I learned that actually if we have a purposeful approach to data, we can clearly create a space from it. And this specific code, Perlin noise from Ken Perlin, was my very first encounter with the idea of using 49 lines of code. We can create mountains, ocean, like pretty much earth phenomena by 49 lines of code. Very godly, I know, but it's possible. So that's my first code I memorized, the first code I learned. And also I was obsessed with this idea of like how we can go beyond 2 dimensions. And it was my very first encounter with data, frozen data as a space, and try to frame the idea of a living surface. So I think from there, I just couldn't stop creating projects. But I think what really transformed and what I am most like doing is inspired by the science fiction a lot. Very William Gibson and Neuromancer was, I think, one of those like books. And then later on, I guess, I mean, Annie Philip K. Dick, and I mean, very much neuroscience and neuroscience and science fiction truly like came into my mind in a like inspiring moment. But I think I was much inspired by the idea of transforming culture and how technology is transforming us, like how we are becoming them entities, and actually how we are becoming them controlled mechanisms by the techniques, by the systems, and how we are becoming these new entities that are only trying to find meaning in the virtual world, being in the physical world, and being in this like limbo of like, don't know where we are exactly. I think sense of displacement became a very inspiring idea. And then also learned that the information is clearly, I mean, bringing us to a surface much quicker, but the depth is not there. And sometimes the age difference and the art context changing quickly. And also I think John Mayer has a great statement, design is a solution to a problem, but art is a question to a problem. And my question was simply, what does it really mean to be a human in 21st century? So what I found that simply humans, machines, and environments are creating an incredible symbiotic relationship. And I found that there's an incredible serendipity when the edge of imagination and edge of technology connects, and actually where the physical and also virtual world connects. I found that there's this symbiotic relationships. Simply going back to Blade Runner, I just decided to move to Los Angeles, I think subconsciously, to get a SNP degree at Los Angeles. But by the way, this is the photo of the 2019 November, Los Angeles. This is what I saw when I came, so completely a disappointed reality change. But I found myself on the street because I found that Creating an art for certain people was a problem for me. Creating art for a museum or gallery was a limited experience or limited reality. So I found that perhaps the art should be for anyone, any age, any background, but to make it happen, that's the only way to, for at least in my perception, was the public space. A space, there is no door, there is no ceiling, there is no floor, there is no corner, it's open and democratically very open, I guess. So as Neil described, like my dream was to really take the Disney Hall as a canvas. But what was really inspiring for me when I go to the building, the question was, can this building learn? Like, can it dream? I think this very, childish imagination, playing with the walls and the doors and the things. I was always like trying to like imagine like, why not a machine becomes a part of a building? Why not like a machine creates a substance, a material that can compute, that can create this new symbiotic relationship with us, that is beyond concrete, glass, or steel. So anyways, 2014, I graduated and I was on the stage, by the way, with this idea alone. And by the way, everyone's saying like, hey, like you're a student, you can't do that. Like this is just crazy idea. Frank Gehry will not reply your email. LA Field will not care about what you are saying. You are just a crazy idea that doesn't belong to any reality. But I was on the stage with my short, and I was one of the, first artists getting this award. Normally, it's an award designed for engineers and products. But for the first time, Microsoft Research given chance to an idea, not to a product. So I think it was a very interesting turn in the arts. Anyway, then becoming a Bill Gates collection is something, but the fun thing is being inside the data of Disney Hall, because Frank Gehry and the team shared the data and I graduate. And I think what really changed my life after that Disney Hall projection inside the Frank Gehry's building. But I want to show something very important, because this was one of my first augmentation of space, truly understanding the interior space of Disney Hall, using the conductor's movement and attached to machine intelligence, and transform the walls of the building by not only using music, but also the motion of the conductor, like connecting time and space. So the conductor was not moving the time, but he was conducting the space. And what was funny is to embed media arts into architecture, we really need a lot of technology. So what you are seeing here is how to embed tons of technology to a space that is not designed for it. The space that wasn't ready for augmentation. Anyway, I mean, we know Frank Gehry very well from architecture field, so he's a very authentically like looking person, and I was shaking like a student. But the good news, he loved the idea. He endorsed, I think, the idea. The feeling was something like this, because that positivity comes from the endorsement, really elevate the, I think, motivation. And we opened our studio in Los Angeles, 2015. And last 5 years, really, we are together as a team of 12 people, can speak 12 language. Our median age is 25, and try to represent everyone, any age, any background, as much as possible. So today I want to show you very quickly what happened in the last several years. We are using data in our work for a long time, but today I want to show you something very important that is really different. By the way, the book Aldous Huxley's Laws of Perception was one of my early inspiring, I think, understanding like how our cognitive systems and consciousness is like has these limitations, or not limitations, but anyway, like there are many projects truly understanding the space context, like this infinity room has 4 walls, 4 ceiling, but what will happen if you step inside the machine randomness? What will happen if an algorithm becomes a space? What will happen, this noise algorithm I mentioned creates a space that is only available when you step inside that world, and creates a space creates a space where there is no like corner, where there is no simply can time and space melt conceptually or contextually. But today, I think the topic is more importantly AI and neuroscience, and I think this is the image transform my imagination. This is an image from Deep Dream, which is a software originated, and it's a deep convolutional neural network by the group of people at Google. And this was, I think, I'm one of those artists like who got shocked when I see that, because I'm not a neuroscientist, but I am in love with neuroscience as a whole that explores the cognitive capacity of humanity. But from the AI perspective, this was the first image that feels, wow, somehow, finally, a machine can have a pattern of hallucination or inception or dreaming process. So I was very fortunate that, by the way, I mean, the Deep Dream as a whole, the event was taken in 2016 in February in San Francisco. The group from Google invited artists and the engineers who were like sharing the speculation about this specific topic of a machine is dreaming, machine is hallucinating concept. But I was very concerned because the AI and its implications are incredibly problematic, right? In just like this is from like a 2017, 18, like incredible amount of problems are going on in the AI and ethically going on. And also we know that when a product comes to life, like this project from Google, maybe people remember that, it's just a funny piece of experience, right? That's how they dream, the Google team, how they dreamed this idea, and that's how it worked. So the distance from the dream and reality for products are super dangerous. And we know that AI should not be like this. AI should be better than this. So anyways, I was super inspired by the idea. And also I was super inspired by how we can really understand this whole territory of embedding machine intelligence into architecture. So I was one of the first arts and resident in the program at Google's Arts and Machine Intelligence. And Blaise Aguirre Arcas was one of the wonderful minds who have been leading the program and supporting the journey. And this is Mike Taika, who was my mentor and also liaison at Google, who really teach me and entire my team how to use AI. So simply, the journey started as applying a very humanly, I think, a cognitive system, like how we can apply a conscious model to a space that can have the information, which is sensor or like any environmental data, turn into a knowledge, and specifically can it turn into a wisdom for an architecture. Of course, that's something a big stretch with the tools we have, but it was just a speculation like many architects are doing. So the book that I think inspired me, The Library of Babel from Jorge Luis Borges, which was an incredibly inspiring piece of experience. And around those days, J. Wright Forster's, I think the mental model was very inspiring, and how like actually a human mental model and how it can be applied to the space. Simply, archive dreaming was the first project to transform the data of a library, 1.7 million documents from a public archive data, and transform it into a space. But the idea was, what happens if we go to this library and we witness that AI is learning while we are watching? Like the moment of learning becomes a performance for a machine. So simply inspired by latent space, a space where the data holds in the mind of a machine, a manifold space that is mathematically impossible to perceive, but can be only visible through algorithms. And then take this information and learn about the many first steps of how to turn data into a space, like how to create these sculptures, which represents the entire archive in a three-dimensional world. And then this created the archive dreaming, which was a 4-channel projection in an immersive environment where you witness AI is literally learning from the patterns of data in an infinite space and creates connections. And then later on, I learned about this potentially, actually, what will happen if AI can also simulate almost realistic hallucinated documents. And that's where I meet with DC again, almost 4 years ago, with thanks to Ian Goodfellow and many others at Google. This idea of a machine can learn and hallucinate start to appear in my mind, in my work. But today, I think what really also makes sense, I think for our dialogue, also, I mean, in general, I think once the AI comes in the game, the other question was, can we witness the moment of remembering, the moment of like cognitive other idea? So I was super inspired by this collaboration of like, for example, this is a collaboration with a USussex Neuro Escape Laboratory. And the question that I was asking, like, can we have the pattern of remembering and transform that into a 3-dimensional surface with the help of machine intelligence? And thanks to neuroscientific data and the patterns of understanding engram, the moment of remembering from the tools, by using AI algorithms, we get an enormous data of EEG recording of memory research and find the moment of remembering and transform it into a 3-dimensional surfaces. Again, going back to the 9 years ago, the noise algorithm, and transform it into a 3-dimensional surfaces in the form of data sculpture and data paintings. So I think this was one of the way that AI, architecture, and neuroscience are connecting each other much purposefully, and try to speculate the feeling of remembering and turning it into a 3-dimensional experience in a 2D surface inspired by Trompe-l'oeil, questions the reality, using architecture model of wall, which is a simple, I think, unit of architecture, but completely augmented by data machine intelligence and human input as the memory. And lastly, and I think what really changed my trajectory was many algorithms like GAN algorithms, but specifically our collaboration with NVIDIA. And as a studio, we have been working with many tech giants, thanks to our writing position in the field, inspired many people, apparently from the engineer perspective. And we had the chance to work with one of the best algorithms, such as GAN algorithms, PG GAN, Style GAN, and Style GAN 2. And I started this concept of machine hallucinations, and maybe machine dreams, and maybe machine delusions, which is with Anil, I would love to talk about. This was the idea of what will happen if machine can hallucinate. It doesn't know what it exactly in the state of consciousness. But of course, as an artist loving in love with the architecture, 2.5 years ago, 2017, start collecting tons of different levels of like spaces. But I think my interest was collective memories, the idea of not personal memories, but the idea of like what we consciously or unconsciously looking at the spaces, what we perceive and what we record. So simply a lot of image archives happening in the studio, but also what is inspiring is how to navigate this space. When machine learns, technically, these are unsupervised learning, meaning we don't know exactly what the machine learns, but we know that it can gather data and the patterns. So other obsession is how we can navigate this universe, how we can see the mind, the space in the mind of a machine. So what you are seeing is a software we developed over the years, now 2 years, is a latent space browser that allows the user to fly in the mind of a machine what it learned in 3 dimensions and try to create a narrative from connecting a state to another state to another state. It's kind of a nonlinear imagination in the mind of a machine, but it kind of creates this hallucinatory like imagery that is based on what it learned. So it's kind of like a mimicking the human mind, but creating a kind of a space again by using another space. So this applied to many architects. So 2 years ago, like all the heroes from Frank Gehry to Zaha Hadid to Tadao Ando, and even right now, NASA GPL engineers allowing us to get every single data taken from the Mars, most likely our next home. But not only take the data and simulate it, also how we can create a space with this information. So I think last 2 years, can we create the space of hallucination, space of delusion, space of like confusion? Like, can we find a creativity by the help of machine? Can we like remember by the machine? Can we learn by the machine? So these kind of like iterations are creating spaces in 2 dimensions and sometimes 4 dimensions, because we also use data and inspire the sound tracks and try to find meaning in those spaces. Or ISS Earth, right? Like ISS, our telescope, the humanity is like maybe the most best selfie, the best Earth selfie machine. Or like, and much, I think, big speculation, what will happen if an AI writes New York City and gets every single data available? And what you are seeing, the images are not real. They are machine hallucinations. They are not a real New York, but feels almost real New York. So we use 113 million images of New York. I think it's probably one of the biggest data ever collected for an artwork in a collective memory consciousness. And we delete every single human from this data. I mean, not delete the humans, the photos with the humans, and only kept the urban, the things that are collectively important, the nature, the items, the buildings, the sky, the things that doesn't have a, hopefully, egocentric expectation, but something that is for the humanity, for the collective consciousness. And at the end, what we discovered that once we have this, once we have a chance to separate ego from data, we witness something very interesting that is purely this hallucinatory space. You are seeing a space in New York, Chelsea Market, 18 channel projections. A machine is hallucinating those potential patterns and creating a 3-dimensional surfaces and augmenting our perception without wearing any glass or any prosthesis. Is pure human consciousness, pure human perception. And even recently in Berlin, we were able to augment a power plant. And even we tried to create 3-dimensional neural networks by using laser to make the invisible more visible. So what you are seeing, a neural network structure, which is pretty invisible, of course, abstraction, and also peoples were 3D tracked in a really huge, like a, I don't know how, power plant, leftover power plant, and this idea of what will happen if near future in Berlin, post-apocalyptic sci-fi moment, a power plant starts to download data and start hallucinating, and people are really rushing there to see what exactly going on here, and suddenly we witness these narratives. And I'm calling it synesthetic architecture because the space is, I think, literally synesthetically creating a symbiotic relationship with the audience. And this is some of those hallucinations from the people, from the history, which is a Berlin, as we all know. Like the history of Berlin is extremely important for humanity. So you can feel different patterns. And the good news, we are using definitely green energy in our works. So we are not harming the nature as much as possible. And lastly, that will say dreams. Frank Gehry's Disney Hall. The idea was, can a building dream? Can it hallucinate? And this was the challenge for studio, because to make a building dream or hallucinate, we thought that we should have an access to every single memory point of the building. And how can we do that? The good news, LA Philharmonic give us 100 years of every single data point available in their archive. Images, photos, videos, sound, Gehry drawings, everything, like security, like imagine every single data point that you can collect. So it was an incredible data. And with Google Arts and Culture, we tackled the challenge and took this information and used very different like neural networks. But the challenge was not the data, how to augment a surface, such as, I mean, not symmetric, surface. Frank Gehry's buildings are reflective and from multiple angles. And at the end, we found out that perfectioning the location of light, 42 projectors, and plus taking Disney Hall original 2002 historic 3D model and deconstruct it into a new form and really create a whole new narrative by using architecture as a canvas, light and data as a substance, and using machine intelligence to transform the building. So I think that was our most speculative, I believe, three-dimensional and publicly available, free for everyone project. We had more than 100,000 people joined us, 2018 September, a true public art project, free for everyone, any age. And I think there was this very unique moment happen once the building starts to dream or perform. And LA Phil is one of the most prevalent, I think, prolific organization in the world using performing arts. And it was an incredible moment that people are coming without tickets, a public space. AI is performing on the building in collaboration with an artist. And you are feeling and hearing every single music recorded and hallucinating. It was just like a very, very fresh narrative that was like really, I don't know, there was something very different than just, you know, a traditional performing arts experience that I can say. And these are images that represents every single sound in the archive, sorted by AI, by a 6 dimension, X, Y, Z, and RGB. And then finally, we said that if a building can dream, like how would do that? So if I was a building and have an AI capacity, I would go online and download every single image that people shooting me. and basically, we download every single image of Disney Hall that we could find and train neural network, PG again, and let the building understand its potential, kind of, like the selfie of the building, and let the AI take over the surface, the skin of the building, and transform the building into 3-dimensional surfaces. So what you are watching, I mean, 2 years ago, maybe now it's old, but it's still a fresh idea in my mind that the building has this capacity of like dreaming and speculating its own form, like judging itself, like why do I need to look like this? Like what makes me this titanium? Like why am I in this form? Anyway, so at the end we made Disney Hall Dreams 2018, and thanks to Frank Gehry and LA Philharmonic and City of Los Angeles, the project I think was one of the most welcomed public art piece in Los Angeles. There was an enormous team, not an alone piece, but happy to say that the 3D transformation of making the buildings like disappear, appear, and most importantly, I think people's reaction, like they become a part of the experience. So architecture is not anymore alone, dark in the like, you know, late night, but has an inside outside, like materialization, parametricism, and machine intelligence, music, and a science fiction, I guess, right? The home of, I mean, many movies, was really inspiring. And Alejandro Inharito was one of the our gala guests, and he was saying, it's the first time I was feeling that I can touch a science fiction. It was an incredible feedback because, I mean, Frank Gehry he was very happy because he said, oh, they said it's not possible. They said it's not possible to project because it's a reflective surface. So we already skipped that part. He was already dreaming a building in downtown. But it was an incredible night. I wish every architect like Frank Gehry, every city like Los Angeles, every institution like LA Philharmonic allows people like me to come and encounter their dreams. And I think it's a kind of a speculation, I guess. And finally, of course, Frank Gehry, he was there very happily, was happy that his building was hallucinating and dreaming. And now we are working with one of the largest data sets with United Nations to let other buildings dream, hopefully in New York soon. Thank you very much, and hope I didn't do too long talk. Thank you.
Refik, that was fantastic. Thanks so much. I would have loved more, but I guess that the purpose is trying to establish some kind of dialogue today to discuss some of those ideas. But super inspirational work, Refik, as always. So thank you. So I want to turn to Anil Seth now, a neuroscientist who is, I guess, a computational neuroscientist. I think what's interesting about Anil's work is that there's an overlap with the deep dream logic that's part of that thing. So I won't say any more, but I would like to invite Anil to say a few words about what his research is all about. Anil.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you, Refik. That was extraordinary. That was beautiful and overwhelmingly impressive, really. So yeah, there's a lot to talk about. I was not aware of your work until Neil pointed me to it a few weeks ago, and I've been looking through it, and it's just beautiful. Anyway, let me try to share my screen, and I will give you a much less visually impressive little walk through some of the similar ideas, I think, from the perspective of a neuroscientist. So yeah, as Neil said, I mean, I trained in experimental psychology, but then did a PhD in artificial intelligence at Sussex in the late 90s. And in 2001, I moved to San Diego, which I still miss it. I love the city so much. And actually, it was probably my first encounter on a day-to-day level with architecture. I was at a place called the Neuroscience Institute, which is in the La Jolla area of San Diego. And this is a very architecturally very famous building by the Chen couple. I can't remember exactly who they were now, but I wish I'd had an image of this in my presentation. It's the director of the Neuroscience Institute was a guy called Gerald Edelman, very famous Nobel Prize winning neuroscientist. And he had this idea that to try to nurture a culture of creative research, the building really mattered. And this is so rare in science. I mean, we live in boxes, and if you're trying to budget for a research institute or just for refurbishing a department, the kind of architectural style of the building you're in is not a very high priority for traditional funders in science. But we inhabited this amazing this building in San Diego. I always remember it was there's a very old film called The Cell, which starred Jennifer Lopez, and sort of not quite up to Blade Runner, but it uses the Neuroscience Institute as a set. And I sort of always remember there was a strange feeling I had walking onto the site that suddenly I was in this sort of land of science fiction. And I had no idea quite whether it did have any real effect, but it certainly, it was a very powerful context. I'm sure it must have had some effect. Anyway, I don't have a picture of it, so I'll stop talking about it. For the last 10 years, I've been back at Sussex, which is on the south coast of England in Brighton, where I am now. And 10 years ago, we set up a Centre for Consciousness Science, the Sackler Centre for Consciousness Science. And this was, it's, well, a decade old now. It's not a beautiful building. I mean, that can be made to hallucinate. It's just a sort of bunch of people that work together. I guess what I should say from the start is that, I've always been interested in consciousness, in what makes experience happen. If you open up the brain and look inside of it, it's just a bunch of stuff. It's just a mushy, spongy, pretty opaque quite small, but surprisingly heavy material. And yet from that comes everything that matters. Nothing in life matters except through consciousness. Our experience of the world, our experience of the self. It's one of the oldest questions in philosophy. It's one of the oldest questions in any form of thinking, really. And it had been very disreputable in neuroscience and psychology for a long time. If you express an interest in studying consciousness, certainly when I was an undergraduate in the 90s and a PhD student, it was typically thought of as, well, that's no way to get a job. That's just, you'll never get anywhere. So what's been fascinating is to witness over the last 10, 15 years, a resurgence of interest in what I think is one of the most central and abiding questions in all of science, in all of intellectual activity. What makes us us? What makes us conscious of the world and of ourselves? And perception is a large part of that. So, and that's what I want to talk about in 10 minutes today. I'll keep a little eye on the time, so we've got time for discussion. And so here's one way in. And the way in I like to think about perception starts very simple, and it starts just with color. You know, we open our eyes, and for most of us, color is such a salient feature of the outside world. It really seems that outside objects have colors, that color is a sort of objective feature of this external reality. Yet, I mean, we don't even need neuroscience to know that this isn't true. This is the electromagnetic spectrum. Our eyes are only sensitive to a very small part of this electromagnetic spectrum. This thin slice of reality is where we live. And so our experience of what's actually out there is in this sense less than the totality of the external world. But in another sense, it's more than that, because colors are not directly given by wavelengths. I mean, we've known since Newton and probably before that every color we experience is generated by the brain through a combination of wavelengths. We construct this infinite universe of colors from 3 wavelengths of light. So what we perceive, even for something as simple as color, is both less than and more than what's out there. And the central message here is that it's always tempting to think of perception as just this process of this passive readout. We open our eyes, and our eyes are these transparent windows onto the world, and there's something inside us, like the self maybe, that's peering through and registering some aspects of this external world. And the truth, I think, is much more complicated and interesting than that. You know, what we perceive as related to the world, but it's a construction that our brains and our bodies and our minds and our histories collaborate with this external reality to generate on the fly. A lot of, we play a lot with simple visual illusions to just drive home this point. I hope this works wherever people are watching this. This is called the lilac chaser. And I really, if you just stare at the black cross in the center of the screen, and if it's working, as it is for me, I'm doing this on my computer at home, the magenta patches disappear, and all you see is one green patch that's rotating around the edges. So it's working for me. And if you blink and move your eyes, the green patch disappears and the magenta patches return. Now, this is, I think, a beautiful example of how constructed our visual experience is. There is no green patch. There are only magenta patches that appear and disappear one after the other. And this is such a powerful illusion because it combines 3 different effects that are all well studied in visual neuroscience. One is troxler fading. If things are off to the periphery of your vision, so away from your central fixation, and if they have indistinct edges, they'll tend to fade from experience. Another thing that's going on is apparent motion. When things appear and disappear next to each other, our brain infers movement. This is, of course, the principle by which cinema, TV works. And finally, there's color opponency. So in this sort of latent space, to use one of Refik's terms, the latent space in which our brain processes and understands color, green is the opposite of magenta. And I actually love this story of why, because if you think about the electromagnetic spectrum, I've already said that color doesn't exist, right? But it turns out magenta exists even less than other colors. If you think of the electromagnetic spectrum, it goes from the red on one side to the violet on the other side. There's no magenta in it. You make magenta by mixing red and blue light together. And if you do that normally, there would be green, because green is, or the wavelength that corresponds for us to green is in the middle of red and blue. But there isn't green in magenta, it's just red and blue. So the brain has to make something up. So what it makes up is magenta. So the opposite of magenta for the brain in its latent color space is green. So when you see green, what you're really seeing is not green. You can get into all sorts of rabbit holes here, but the take home is that there's this very, very indirect relationship between the sensory information that we get and what we experience. And that's in contrast to this sort of naive realism that normal perception presents us with, that we're directly perceiving what's out there. Of course, that naive realism is also challenged by art, and it's challenged by hallucinations, and it's challenged by all sorts of other things as well. And my work kind of day to day is to try to understand the nature of this indirect relation between the world and what we experience in our conscious perception through the notion that the brain is a prediction machine. And what do I mean by that? Well, again, imagine that you are a brain and you're locked inside this bony skull, and you only have indirect access to things in the world, whether they are buildings or coffee cups or other people or other people's thoughts or other people's feelings. All the brain gets are electrical signals, which are noisy and ambiguous, and they don't come with labels like I'm this particular color or I'm from a glass of wine. So perception, almost in principle, has to be a process of inference, a process of best guessing, where the brain combines these unlabeled, ambiguous electrical signals with its prior experiences. It's, if you like, its individual and collective set of developmental and evolutionary memories that are embedded into its structure. And it combines these sensory data with these prior beliefs to form its perception of what's out there. So what we perceive is the brain's best guess of the ultimately unknowable causes of sensory signals. You can think of this idea back in philosophy many, many centuries to, I usually trace it to Helmholtz and then to Kant, and the idea of the noumenon, the unknowable physical reality that we experience as manifest in some way. Another very quick example of how pervasive this is called Adelson's checkerboard. If you look at the two patches A and B, they will appear to be different shades of gray, but they are not. They're exactly the same shade of gray, which you can see if I just join them up here. And it's a continuous shade of gray. Move it across and you can see, I'm not cheating, it's the same shade of gray. Take it away and they look different again. What's happening here is that the brain has one of the beliefs that the brain has, and that you're not aware of, but the brain has it anyway, is that objects in shadow are lighter than they appear. And that's why we experience B as lighter than A. Our brain is compensating for the effects of shadows. We are seeing an interpretation, not the raw sensory data. This can happen in a very online, very quick way too. This is a sort of an example of what we call a Muni image or a two-tone image. If you haven't seen it before, probably what you'll just see is a bunch of black and white splodges, and without any particular organization. And sorry, I'm just moving something so I'm not staring off to the side. But if you look at it, so not much going on there, but now if I fill it in, you'll see there's a picture there, and it turns out to be a picture of a butterfly against the background. Now, if you stare at that for a little while, I won't leave it up too long because we don't have much time, but if I take this now away, you might still be able to see echoes of that butterfly in the patches of black and white. And what's interesting here is the sensory information has not changed. All that's changed is your brain's predictions about the causes of that information, and your visual experience changes. So what was previously just black and white nonsense becomes organized into a coherent scene. We see through and with our brain's predictions. If we think about what this means for the brain, this idea that perception is constructed, it changes quite a lot about what you might think of as the naive or the common sense view of perception. The common sense view of perception is this view that we just read out sensory signals. There's a retina, visual information comes into the brain, this is a monkey brain, and reads out aspects of the visual scene of greater complexity the deeper you get into the brain. So lines and edges in early stages, and faces and people and places at later stages. But it's all happening in this outside-in direction. Now, the idea of the brain as a prediction machine inverts that, so that instead of perception depending on sensory signals coming into the brain from the outside, it depends just as much, if not more, on these perceptual predictions flowing in the other direction, the top down or the inside out. Now, technically, mathematically, theoretically, what this amounts to is this idea that the brain is doing something like Bayesian inference on the causes of sensory signals. Now, Bayesian inference is a very, very well-established principle of statistics and logic and reasoning. We kind of do it all the time. It's what formalizes this idea of best guessing, where we have ambiguous sensory data, we have some prior deletes, and we combine them to form the best guess. And the way the brain does it, we think, and this is where the sort of nitty-gritty of my interests lie, how does the brain accomplish this? And the idea, very roughly, is that the brain is continually sending predictions from the inside out, from the top down. And what we used to think, and these are the blue arrows, what we used to think of sensory signals that convey, bring the world into us, they're actually prediction errors. They're differences between what the brain expects and what it gets at every level of processing. And perception, in this view, is this continual process of calibration, of trying to explain away prediction errors. And it's that process, and so that leads this whole circuit to settle on an approximate Bayesian inference about the causes of sensory data. And that, at least the hypothesis is, that's what we consciously perceive. So there's a route here from some simple demonstrations to some principled thoughts about what perception might involve, down to the nitty-gritty of how brain circuits work. And of course, it's this nitty-gritty that we can start to draw relations with AI as well. Because if we change the balance, if perceptual predictions become a little bit too strong, they're going to overwhelm sensory signals and our perceptions will change. We know this already, and we know it from toy examples. We know it from seeing faces in clouds or faces on buildings. This is probably as close as I get to Refik, your visuals here. Slightly less impressive. But faces for us are very, very powerful, very salient stimuli. So we tend to project them onto and into things. But it's much more general than that. This just serves to illustrate it. And this brings me to the deep dream architecture, which, by the way, I was sort of also rather stunned by when I saw it emerge from the Google Labs, because we've been playing with neural networks for a long time. And one of the questions in these things had always been, well, how do we represent what's going on inside the network? And that's, of course, the question that the Google engineers were trying to address. You have these very complex networks. What's happening inside them? And how the deep dream algorithm really works is you present it with an image, and instead of updating the network's prediction of what's in the image, you update the image itself until the prediction is satisfied. So it's a sort of way of implementing this idea of overly strong predictions. And my postdoc at the time, Keisuke Suzuki, took the deep dream algorithm, and the one fun thing we did, it was really just because we wanted to see what it would be like. We'd taken some panoramic video of the Sussex University campus, and to each panoramic frame, we applied the deep dream algorithm. And then we did some continuity stuff and then replayed it through head-mounted display. And this is so it's not quite as the same just seeing it on a flat screen. And this gave a sort of machine hallucination too. We called the paper the hallucination machine. And it looks a little like a psychedelic hallucination. And it's for us, it was an extraordinary way of thinking about how can we actually use AI of this sort to model different kinds of unusual perception and therefore understand more generally how perception happens. So the take-home message from this is really that if hallucinations are kind of uncontrolled perception, where our top-down predictions break free from the constraints of sensory data, then even when you just open your eyes and you just see a boring wall on the other side of your window, well, that is also a kind of hallucination, but it's a controlled hallucination, where your perceptual best guesses are always and all the time being reined in by these sensory signals from the world. We're constantly being caught in the grip of this tightly coupled interaction between our brains' best guesses and what the world provides to rein them in. Now, a few years ago, I got fascinated by resonances of this idea outside neuroscience and AI. And one concept I want to mention, maybe especially for this audience, was this behold as shared, this pretty classic concept from the history of art. And this was from Ernst Gombrich, whose work I really enjoyed reading over the last few years. And the behold as share idea is very simple. It's sort of the idea that expectations constrain and construct what we experience. It's the power of expectation rather than the power of conceptual knowledge that molds what we see in life no less than in art. So we have expectations about everything. They really drive what we perceive. And this idea that there can be an innocent eye that just transparently reflects what's out there is just not possible. One cannot perceive what one cannot classify. And the way we classify things doesn't just shape, it really constructs what we perceive. Now, just to finish, I've talked mainly so far about sort of visual images and how we can use these ideas to understand the content of our visual experience. But I think the true significance of these ideas goes a lot deeper. One of the things that most invigorates me about it is that it applies to how we experience the self as well. Naively, we might tend to think of the process of perception somewhat like this. There's a world, sensory data comes in through our eyes. It's the self that is sort of looking out through the windows of the eyes, which interprets this sensory data so that we perceive the world. But if the self is itself a perceptual best guess, I mean, the brain is also isolated from the body, then the self becomes a perception too. So both world and self are controlled hallucinations. We construct our experience of being who we are in exactly the same way, or in interestingly different but related ways to how we construct the experience of the world. And this is, I think, the last slide. So things that we've been doing in the lab at Sussex, trying to figure out how far we can take this view. What other aspects of human experience and animal experience, or potentially machine experience, can we explain this way? So I've just mentioned the self. Emotions can be thought of as perceptions of the interior of the body in reaction to the world. Even experiences of free will, which we feel very centrally to be, so centrally that we get ourselves in all sorts of unnecessary metaphysical knots about this. But experiences of free will can be also understood as perceptions. Then back to the visual stuff. Whoops, this is the wrong order. Hold on. Is this going to start? Yeah. How we understand objects. So objects can be understood in terms of predictions about how visual inputs might change contingent on our action. So there's a way of understanding how objecthood is manifest in our experience, which relates a lot to what Refik was saying about trompe-l'oeil and how we perceive depth, but not just depth, when it means to say that something has a back even though we cannot see the back. So there's these subtle aspects of phenomenology that I find interesting. Time, we can understand time also as a perception, not just as the medium through which perceptions happen. And change, change is not the same, is not given to us either. We infer change. When our perceptions change, it's not always the case that we perceive them as changing. Perception of change is not the same thing as change of perception. And then there's this sense of reality itself, which is always put into question by any sort of hallucination or delusion. Perhaps the bedrock aspect of the naive view of perception is that what we experience is real. Yet we know from psychiatry that there are many syndromes where people are not necessarily hallucinating false realities, but what they perceive is drained of a sense of being real. This dimension, experience of something really existing, like time, like change, like objecthood, is another aspect of perception. It's another thing that the brain constructs, not something that we take for granted. So we're trying to, using now different kinds of extended reality, we're trying to bring that concept into the lab too. And a lot of this work depends on going beyond the original deep dream. And as Refik said as well, there are many exciting developments in AI and machine learning. And some of these are happening at Sussex as well with colleagues like Kris and Alec Chance. We're trying to figure out, trying to just bring together this algorithmic understanding of perception and of learning, and then parlay that into a new appreciation of the implications for how we might perceive the world and the self. So I have no idea how long I spoke for, but I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anil. That was tremendous.
Let me stop sharing.
Well, there's so many overlaps that I was not aware of before, and points of discussion. Not quite sure how I'm going to fit it all in. But maybe I'll just kick it off. I mean, I guess one thing I would just want to, a general comment I would like to make first of all, maybe, is to say that this is an astonishing moment in a way, where we're getting some overlap between an AI-based artist and a neuroscientist who's kind of using AI there's an overlap there, which I don't think ever really existed before. I mean, in the sense I've always seen neuroscience as being the next step on from psychoanalysis and earlier kind of models. And of course, the problem with psychoanalysis, as entertaining and as rich as it might be, is it's unproven. What we get with neuroscience is a much more rigorous scientific approach towards things, which in many cases is actually validating some of the earlier observations that were made in psychoanalysis. At least that's the way that I see it. And I know that some neuroscientists, Antonio Damasio being one example, are kind of highly influenced by the work of Freud and early psychoanalysis. But this seems to be an astonishing kind of moment where everything is coming together at a certain sort of point. And we ignore it as our peril. It's super interesting. I mean, what I also found actually, that it's not just psychoanalysis that's kind of echoing in the background, also in a strange way, continental philosophy. Interestingly, in the University of Sussex, Jeff Bennington was there for many years in the French department until they unfortunately shut down that department. Of course, Bennington was famous for engaging with Jacques Derrida. And of course, one of the central tenets of Derrida's thinking was the notion of construction, how we are constructed. And of course, architects took that in a very literal way and sort of think he's talking about buildings. He wasn't talking about buildings. He was talking about how the mind constructs things in a certain kind of way. And what I found super interesting about some of the things you were saying, Anil, is actually we're getting a kind of an echo of also what Derrida was saying, in the sense that when we talk about how data is used in AI, often that data is bias. And one of the kind of key logics that Derrida was always arguing was to say that when we see the world in terms of privilege hierarchies. In other words, whereas maybe theory and practice, or male and female, should be seen as kind of balanced out, we always tend to see a kind of an imbalanced version. One term is privilege over the other. Male tends to be privilege over female, and practice over theory, and so on and so on. But it seems to me that that notion of a bias is actually coming out also in the world of AI and neuroscience right now. So we're in a kind of fascinating juncture when things are coming together in a really interesting way. Maybe I should kind of kick off though by asking Anil, to what extent can we use some of this vocabulary that Refik's been using? You know, terms like dreaming or consciousness or memories and things, which of course can be used metaphorically. And many of us do use those terms metaphorically. And clearly, literally, buildings can't dream. But to what extent is it valid to use these terms for the kind of work that Refik does?
I mean, to me, that's it. All depends on the context, and you know, these words they're not the sole territory of one discipline or another. Something like, you know, dreaming is a word that goes back to, you know, dream time, something like that, before language. And of course, there has to be care taken against over literal interpretations of things. That's true in both directions as well. I think it's true when neuroscientists or AI people sort of run a deep dream algorithm on something and call it art. I mean, that's probably not, you know, that's a misuse of those kinds of terms too. So we need care, but dreaming, just to take that example, is, you know, very incompletely understood within psychology and neuroscience. It's in terms of what it's for, how it works, what relation it has to perception in the here and now. And I think it's completely valid and super interesting to think of of that word providing a metaphorical bridge between what happens in our brains at night and the kind of work that Refik is doing. By the way, I wanted to mention one thing that came to mind, Refik, when you were showing your dreaming buildings was maybe unexpectedly, the octopus. I don't know if you've ever hung out with octopuses. I spent a week with them about 10 years ago in Naples at the Stazione Zoologica. And their form is so different from our form. And one of the amazing things is their external form changes so much. They change shape, but not only shape, they change texture. And you see these washes of vivid color flowing across their bodies. It's a language that nobody really understands. I mean, you can say, oh, it's afraid, or oh, it's calm, but who really knows? And then recently I saw some footage of a dreaming octopus, and this octopus was behaviorally asleep, yet all these beautiful colors were washing across its skin. And that imagery just, I couldn't help bringing it to mind when I saw your dreaming buildings.
That was an incredible, actually, imagery, I remember. But I think what really your presentation make me much more confident that I think when you say that, when the terms are not like belonging to like certain fields or like research, what really makes, I think, again, I wish I'm an architect. I wish I have a neuroscience more background that really go deeper. But I think when you mentioned that like this perception model, right? I think what maybe Anil, your question goes to this: can we architect the perception? I think we are architecting the perception. I think it's not about like really architecting a space in like a traditional mean of like concrete or again glass or steel or whatever like algorithm. It's just I think because as you Anil, like I mean clearly we witnessed that our perception can be architected. Like it's just a model of system, an engineered experience in somewhere here. Some people say it's physical because when we hit our head we lose it. That means that's a physical experience. It's kind of an architecture, we can say, maybe in some capacity. Maybe we don't know the circuits, maybe we don't know like really the inner world of what we have here completely and 100%, but we know that we can architect what we see here and perceive. So why not we only architect the spaces that we inhabit? Why not we also architect our perception with the arts? So I think it's yes, it's a speculation maybe, but maybe it's something will go away when you're not believing it. But it's a kind of a fun. I mean, again, maybe for the people, what is art, right? Like, I mean, for me, art is humanity's capacity of imagination. And for me, the success is literally making dream to real, like very simple concepts. Then I think it gets much more contextually simple because, okay, what is the success here? Like, can we make a building dream? And then okay, a dream process is like based on the cognitive, skills. Like, I think if we apply this model, I believe, to many parts of architecture, like finding material, finding context or function, or innovating a material, like, I mean, Neri Oxman's like journey with the materials, for example, I mean, her inspiration from the nature and applications to like the physical world or computational world, I mean, it's a similar, I think, idea, like that material can only exist when you architect it, right? So, and I think your inspiration that in the keynote, and I think, Neil, your question was truly like spiked my mind, like it's architecting perception. So eventually,
Refik, if I could add to your comment, this is super interesting. And thank you both, Anil and Refik, for your incredible work and research. I think the architecting perception is a really interesting conversation to take on. And it reminded me of a work that Knox did long ago, which was an installation to hang 250 paintings developed through painters who use psychedelics. So they were hallucinating when they were doing these paintings, and they were many different sizes of painting, from large to small scale. And how we sort of architected that experience of hallucination was to embody the feeling of vortex or falling down. And as the project was to lay out 250 paintings that were based on hallucinogenics, as well as giving the viewers the feeling what the painters were feeling when they were painting that. So there's this sort of dynamic historical as well as the present moment of experience that we're exchanging. But what was really interesting about this specifically was the position of the body, the different sizes of the paintings and where they were placed, and how we looked at the paintings. And if we were turning to rotate the painting at a small area of the museum installation where it can hang, then our body and looking at the painting is going through this process of the experience of falling or vortexing or hallucinating. And the question that I bring to both of you, and I feel that this whole perceptual soup let's say, this readiness potential of potential forces that create the outcome of consciousness or reality, as we say it. How does the body that is both static and active view or perceive differently? Because we understand that perception is through action, and most of the work, Refik, is a visual still with a lot of dynamic internal to your image, but it's still a still image. So the body that's in movement or the image that's in movement, how do we perceive differently?
I think it's a great question, Kris. One information I have in my hand as a more like maybe solid data is our project called Infinite Room, an incredibly inspired Kusama's like a legendary idea, but applied to, I mean, a feature of algorithms. So the project was witnessed by 2 million plus people, thanks to Asia visit. And then suddenly, like, I found this more information. By the way, the project went all the continents except Antarctica. So the data that I'm talking is, I think, pretty relevant. I mean, we saw 6-month-old babies and like families. So it's really like a very diverse audience. In Geneva, there was a group of people who spent some serious time in the room. And I didn't know that. They just emailed me later by their, like, I think they're psychologists and psychiatrists, like a group of like young minds, like really understanding the phenomena of like being in an immersive room. And they said something very interesting. And one of them were staying like around 6 minutes. And by the way, the room is like really, I mean, 4-corner wall, the simplest architecture ever, a room, like nothing special. But the ceiling and the floor is mirror. And when we have a quality mirrors, you really, like, if you don't see the seams, if it becomes really perfection space, one of them were in the center of the room looking to the infinity, which pretty much like a very obsessive, I think, audience experience, like in the center, looking to the infinity, like all this. He said something interesting. After like 6 minutes, I felt like time and space is melting. I was static for sure, and I was laying on down, and my hands are truly on the other mirror on the floor. But my perception was imagining that I am completely flying in some certain feeling of like a strong ride in a amusement park, or like this kind of feeling. But it was not something, I think music here is the key, at least in that context. I think it was a very hallucinatory state in the conscious mind that was not designed for to be in the like sleep mode or some other disease. That person was consciously put himself into that state. So that means if the architecture allows you to alternate your perception without any substance, technically, I think it's a proof that we have this chance. I mean, James Turrell or Robert Irwin, Dan Flavin, like light and space art movement, right? Early 70s and I mean 60s. Like, I think I'm pretty sure that area also inspired by some substance for sure, but also that movement was very early technological. I mean, they didn't have this, you know, fancy projectors or, you know, seamless whatever materials. Maybe Anil, I don't know, like I felt that like light and space movement 70s, 80s, like 60s, they were like already discovering this expanded cinema context, like enhancing the spaces, cinema, domes, like they were like already there, but it wasn't architectural context, I guess.
I mean, this raises this really fascinating issue for me about perception as well, which is, you know, what's going on in the periphery. I mean, when we're inhabiting a space, we know from visual neurophysiology that you know, we have high resolution vision only in a very surprisingly narrow central region. People sometimes say, you know, that, well, there's a problem here because we perceive the whole visual world as detailed and colored. I'm not actually sure that's true at all. You know, I'm very interested in actually what the phenomenology of our visual periphery is. It's to me, it's not necessarily equally sharp, nor is it blurry. So, you know, I sort of understand this as, well, we don't expect it to be so sharp, so it is what it is. You know, it's expectedly blurry, which is not, you know, blurriness is when you expect something to be sharp and it's not sharp. So, so for me, these things, you know, all these ideas of how a space works on our visual perception call on these things which are understudied in the lab, because we tend to put people 50 centimeters in front of a computer monitor and ask them to press a button, and we lose these more ecological aspects of vision. But back to what you said, Kris, and this idea of the importance of movement and embodiment and perception. Of course, there's a huge tradition of this in psychology that you know, for people listening, goes back to predominantly James Gibson, one of the drivers of this field, which he called ecological psychology. And his main theme was that we don't perceive the world as it is, we perceive it as we are, or we perceive the world in terms of affordances. We perceive a door for opening, not just as an object that we try to represent its three-dimensional structure. Everything that we perceive it as it's useful for us to do so. And this actually, I think, echoes nicely with this idea of architecting perception, because architecture, for me anyway, brings to mind this fusion of function and form. And to understand perception, we need to understand what perception is for. And it's all too easy to slip into this idea that, well, the best perception we could possibly have would be the maximally veridical, the maximally representative, the maximally accurate representation of the external world. And this is not the case, right? It's not useful for us to see everything that's there. It's too much of it. And also some of it's not relevant. So what we need to do is perceive the world as it's most useful for us to do so. There's a terrific example of how we perceive balls that we're trying to catch. Somebody throws you a ball and you're running and you're trying to catch it. And you might think that you figure out through your perceptual system where it is in 3D space. Your brain calculates where it's going to land, and you run there and you catch it. But this is not what happens. It's not what people do. Our perceptual systems work by, in this case, it's sort of they minimize. They try to keep constant the way the ball appears in terms of its angular acceleration to the horizon. And if you do that in such a way, it'll hit you between the eyes inevitably. So it's actually a very simple, almost like feedback thermostat type way of understanding perception. And if you think about, actually, that's what it visually feels like to catch a ball. You don't perceive where it's going to land. You perceive the ball as maintaining a relationship to you in the act of catching. And so if you have a different body or the same body in a different task, you're going to perceive the world differently. And just to close a loop here, this now comes back to some of the work that we're getting very interested in machine learning and AI, where typically AI is done by having huge amounts of data, as Refik, you illustrated beautifully. You try and basically collect every data possible for a given project. And you train your algorithms based on that, in a big data sense. This is not how we learn to perceive. Yep. We sample our environments. We choose what data to learn from. Yes. And to perceive from. And this is something that most machine learning algorithms do not yet do. There's no principled way. The idea is more data, the better. So we're working on algorithms, and others too, that strategically forage for data to learn from, which means they have to have a model of their own uncertainty and of how that uncertainty might be resolved. And this can be in an abstract data space, just what you're trying to classify medical images. So what subset of medical images do I need to look at in order to better diagnose this particular disease? Or it could work in the latent space of perception, and then it might sort of reflect more on our phenomenology. So this raises the question, perhaps part of our visual experience is not representing things as they are. It's not even representing things as they're useful for our current behavior. They're representing epistemic opportunities too, opportunities for discovery of new information that we can use to refine our models. And for me, an exciting thing is when we build AI models like this, we can then see, we can basically do the deep dream experiment and say, well, what did they perceive? These models that are foraging for data. And maybe that's sort of another step where we can find a future parallel.
Following this idea of architecting perception, personally, I'm mostly involved in this kind of process of augmenting creativity. In a way, so also in the office, Coquillon Blau, what we are looking at is, in a way, how you can challenge your perception as a designer. Because we are talking about how people are perceiving certain things and how we are architecting, in a way, the perception that what people perceive. But for us, it's, in a way, the discussion on how you, in a way, control or how you architect your own perception as a designer. Yeah? Because most of the time, like when you're designing something, like you're saying, is this kind of power of expectation. So you are looking at something like a composition, and automatically you assign a sort of value perception, something to that, yeah. your brain, and it's hard for you to actually switch to a different way of looking at that specific thing and seeing something else. Yeah. So we are really trying to look at AI in a way to try to challenge that. Yeah. So we have some models where what we are doing is an AI looks at the composition. For us, that composition will be, let's say, you're looking from top down at a building, but we are blindsiding our AI not to see that. So then it gives a completely novel interpretation or perception of that, yeah. And then that challenges, in a way, your perception as a designer. And when you're engaging with that process, then you always, challenge that, yeah. So I think also this aspect is interesting, not only the aspect of how we impose a certain perception and people outside see certain things, but also how we as designers, for example, how we manage that. Because like you are also saying, Anil, is like our perception is so limited by, or so much constrained about by our experiences, yeah, our past experiences, and we fall many times in certain patterns of looking at things, yeah. And I think those chains are very hard and to break. And I know if you saw that example with the bicycle, that when you turn left, the bike goes right and the other way around, yeah. And usually, like for older people, it's harder in a way to break that pattern and to learn to ride the bicycle that way than for a kid, yeah. For whom the brain plasticity, it's much greater, yeah. So I think designers, they are engaging with these kind of processes, only that's very hard in order to break those perceptions most of the time, yeah.
Can I step in there? I think one of my theories is that we are trained in a way as architects to see the world in a certain way. I think Memo Acton's very amazing video of how you can train a neural network to see things in anything, fire, or in the case of obviously the deep dream one that Anil was showing, dogs and so on. And that therefore we are constructing a certain reality based on how we're trained. I want to just pick up one particular point though, to pick up on, just to go further with this, the kind of the connection between neuroscience, or the overlaps between neuroscience and psychoanalysis. I've already mentioned a couple of times that, to my mind, there are very close parallels between Anil's way of thinking about reality as being a kind of controlled hallucination, and some of the ideas coming out of Slavoj Žižek, the idea that somehow fantasy is constitutive of how we see the reality. We don't see reality itself, but it comes to us through the detour of the imagination. In other words, don't talk to me about reality. It's not that reality isn't out there, but the way in which we perceive it is already filtered in some way, as through a kind of neural network and so on. No, but what I want to pick up on though is a slight different aspect of that. I mean, Lacanian psychoanalysis is really interesting because it argues that we don't engage with reality. It comes to us filtered in a certain sort of way. And there was one aspect that I came across before in Lacan, Jacques Lacan, where he talks about how knowledge is, and its kind of basis, animate knowledge. It's animated. We see the world as people more than as things, which is an interesting kind of idea. And certainly, I think Anil's sort of image of the cloud and the face coming out of the cloud was a wonderful example of how we tend to sort of read human things into that. But what I want to pick up on is something that I've not thought about before until today, and that is the possibility, if we see the world in terms of animate life rather than objective knowledge, does that mean that we potentially want to animate the world? In other words, the idea that Refik had, that he came to LA and wanted to animate the building, literally to bring alive Frank Gehry's Walt Disney Concert Hall, is that something that is actually at work from a neuroscientific point of view, the idea of a kind of animate way, animation of the building? Anil.
I think there are almost two meanings of animation going on here, I think, that are interesting to explore. I mean, there's the very sort of, I suppose, obvious interpretation of animation as things that move. You know, we can create movement and we can interpret that movement. And there's the sort of more, how one would say it, life-associated sense of animacy that we interpret things as having agency, as having purpose. And you're absolutely right that this is a built-in very deeply into our perceptual systems, into our neural systems more generally. I mean, you mentioned something, I can't remember the example you gave, but it made me think of quite a famous experiment in psychology where they had an animation in the first sense, you know, moving images, but the moving images were just a couple of triangles and a circle. And they moved in such a way that it's impossible to watch that movie without attributing emotions and purpose to these very, very simple, maximally reduced shapes. You know, one triangle is bullying the circle and the other triangle is trying to protect it. And there's none of that in there. They're just circles and a couple of triangles. So yeah, we do read and write the world through these sorts of principles. And I think this is something I didn't talk about at all, but you know, there are all these multiple levels, I think, at which our expectations sculpt our experience. And at the most basic level, they're expectations that are hardwired into our visual cortex, such as shadows of light coming from above, or shadows working in a particular way, edges lining up and forming objects, all that sort of thing. Then there are lifetime experiences that we might bring to bear. The importance of particular people, particular faces. But then we have these higher level priors as well, higher level expectations which come from society and from culture. Now, these are also provide us with beliefs that we may not be aware of having that shape our perception. And this brings us right back to what you said about bias. You know, an AI algorithm might be biased if you train it on the wrong data. And of course, if you allow an AI to sample what data it learns from, you can make the problem 100 times worse. So that's something we're very aware of. You could build in not just bias, but a reinforcing circle of bias. And our perceptions too are like that. It's not just that we're cognitively biased or we have response biases in particular ways. I think a very open question in perceptual psychology is, how do the cultural stereotypes, the society level beliefs, how do they actually drill down to shape what we perceive and not just what we say or do about what we perceive?
I think just to, sorry if I could add to that, how we attach onto certain kind of perceptual information may also come from our histories, right? Our memories and our histories that have led us to catch onto that set of information. But also, it's controversial, but there's a thing called mirror neurons that when we actually perceive something, that we actually feel what we are seeing based on the experiences we've had in the past as well. And so, and it can happen from animate or inanimate objects, that we actually get this feeling, this perceptual feeling based on observation.
Yeah, I'm sort of have a little bit of history of being mean to mirror neurons, so I'll try to resist that. It's for me, there's this kind of there's this tendency in some parts of neuroscience to be very reductionist and say, like, you know, this neuron is imbued with this kind of mirror magic, and no, it's super interesting that our perceptual systems, you know, can in a sense enact what we perceive, and it's perhaps not so surprising as well. I mean, the work in AI that Refik is using too, and then Daniel also, that and this goes back to work by Geoffrey Hinton in the 80s, that in order to perceive something, we have to learn how to generate it. You know, in order to perceive numbers, learn to draw numbers. That's a classic machine learning paper from the very early days of autoencoders. So to me, it's no surprise that to perceive something, the generative models that underlie this whole process of prediction, you know, within their space, within their latent space, they have to have these possibilities. And so mirror neurons are just sort of, if you like, one surface feature of that more interesting systems level architecture that's going on.
And I think what really, by the way, inspired me a lot about also in this dialogue, like when we said, again, it was just a dialogue with a colleague about architecting perception, because there was this moment that it's architecture, it's neuroscience, but artful. It's at the end a speculation that may happen or not. But what was really inspiring this latent space and the AI context is, as we all know, the computational power and the context of algorithms are not live formats, right? We have this frozen reality, which is completely the opposite of what we have, right? We can learn to learn, and technically we can learn forever, hopefully without any disease. But for the AI model is just like a kind of this mini gamification of or playfulness of consciousness, because there is no way we can really, I mean, maybe in quantum computing we will have completely different contextualization of reality. But before, I think we are just a couple of maybe decades or maybe years, I don't know, before our reality is questioned by the whole computation domain of quantums, right? And then now we are in this state, I mean, short, what I'm trying to say is maybe we just need to be a little bit rush on our experiments with machines before they have this much larger and bigger and heavier statements that will be much harder to perceive and, you know, accept or expect. So that's one of the reasons I feel like if we, in architecture, I think what I love, my friends and colleagues and people, that they know how to speculate, right? Like they have a speculation models, like put in incredible materials, ideas, thoughts, may happen or may not happen, but at least we feel it, right? We get an, oh, it's a cultural building, it's a space station that in a Mars colonies, like this, all this already exists in architecture. But in neuroscience, what I found also inspiring is once like edge of imagination and edge of technology, like really comes together, there is this serendipity potential. And I think architecting perception by any knowledge form in humanity really captures something that is a kind of a new, maybe shamanic experience, maybe, I don't know, not that maybe really, something like very absolute philosophical, theological, mathematical context. Like it's so interesting that with grounding ideas in certain, you know, reality, we can still build up a reality that feels almost real, but still not real. So I think cinema is doing this for many, I mean, decades, right? It's using reality to construct a reality. It's not real, but it uses every single real, I mean, components and data. So what I feel very inspired in this dialogue is like really what we are creating our own reality based on what we learn. But in the meantime, to prove this reality, to live in it, to feel it, to touch it and hear it, we still need to make it. So I think what makes sometimes architecture limited is speculations are just beautiful renders and talks and ideas. But once this whole idea becomes real, that you can go inside, step inside, you know, can touch it, you know, not anymore just a render or thoughts of words, then Anil, I feel like we are coming to this moment of like really the edge of reality, like really, oh wow, okay, this is now becoming real, not anymore sci-fi movie or in a, like in an amazing, you know, render. So that's really very exciting to be there. Yeah. Like,
no, there's the importance of the tangible is super interesting. There, I mean, we're doing, so one thing that comes to mind there, one of the experiments we're doing at the moment is so it's, what you say about cinema is really interesting as well, because if you're in a cinema and it's a good film, in one sense you're immersed in it. In one sense, your mind is with the character, and you feel things as, you know, they're sort of happening. But you still know at another level that you're not there, that you're in a cinema. You're not so confused that you'd be in the same way that somebody with psychosis and delusions are confused about what their current reality actually is. You still know that you're in a cinema. And we've actually, again, because I think certainly in this kind of neuroscience, a lot of it starts with creativity and just playing around too, like the hallucination machine. So we thought, can we set up a system where actually people are confused, they don't know, or they get it wrong about whether their environment is real or not. And so we've been able to do this by taking panoramic video from a particular environment again, and then having people go into the same environment, making sure all the lighting is exactly the same, everything like, and then they put the headset on and there's a camera. And so they either see the live feed through the camera or the pre-recorded panoramic video. And if you do it right, you can switch between the two, and people do not know that what they're seeing is no longer real. And for me, I'm not, you know, there's many directions we could take this, but the idea that you can actually within the lab generate a situation where you can systematically manipulate not just what people perceive, but whether they perceive it as real or not is a interesting opportunity. But yeah, I mean, when you actually build something and you have a building there, it makes such a difference. In my PhD, we did a lot of stuff on robotics, and we were trying to build perceiving and behaving robots. And a lot of this work moved into simulation because we were trying to evolve neural networks to control the robots because we didn't know how to design them. So let's just have random populations of neural networks, kind of like a still a machine learning algorithm of a type, it's a genetic algorithm. But it takes very, very long. So we moved a lot of this stuff in simulation, and then you put it back into a real robot, it would never work. And there's an idea that one of my fellow PhD students at the time, Nick Jacoby, called the reality gap. How do you train something in simulation so that it works when you download it to a metal piece of stuff? And his trick, and I've only just thought, I don't know if it's relevant at all, but his trick, super interesting. He designed his simulation world to be really noisy. So he designed a simulation so that it was systematically unreliable, so that any network that performed well in that simulated world, by definition, could not be relying on that part of the simulation being accurate. So that when he transferred it to the real world, it was much more robust. So this was again, it's just a eye-opening moment for me in my career. This was like in the 90s, and this idea that simulation is not to be measured on its veridicality. The world inside the simulation was crazy. Like walls would be narrow and then they'd be over there, just to prevent the robot sensors relying on exactly an accurate measurement of where the wall was. You make them move all over the place, then the robot doesn't care. So that's architecting the robot's perception by systematically manipulating the reliability of the environment it's in. I thought was fascinating.
By the way, it just reminds me, sorry, one quote from Philip K. Dick, like really inspired me a lot. It says, "Reality is that which doesn't go away when you stop believing in it. Yeah. A simulation is that which doesn't stop when the stories go away. Stories are responsible to our human desire for resolution, but a simulation is responsible only to its own laws of initializing conditions. A simulation has no moral, prejudice, or meaning. Like nature, it just is." I think it was just a very similar resonance. So,
Anil, can I just pick up on something to do with the concept of Refik's concept of projecting onto things? Again, I would go back to the psychoanalysis. I know that area better than neuroscience.
Doing that, and I keep evading it.
Sorry, yeah, but one of the things that that Freud says, and it's echoed in Lacan and so on, is that we either record things. He calls it introjection. You absorb it, or you project. You project things out, and that kind of reminded me very much of your diagram, where we're reading the world, but also projecting our guesswork onto that thing. Now, I've often thought about this in terms of architecture, how we project meanings onto buildings. In a sense, they are inert in themselves, but we project associations from what we've done there, from memories and so on. And there was a particular installation by Krzysztof Wojcicki, who's taking part in this Digital Futures World project, where he projected in Trafalgar Square in London, in the days of apartheid, he projected a swastika onto the South Africa House in Trafalgar Square, and that he was kind of saying this is a kind of form of a Nazi regime in a way. But what was so interesting is how it, to my mind, replicated how we think. Now, does neuroscience have a similar sort of understanding of how we project in a way that almost echoes the way that Refik is projecting onto buildings, onto spaces and so on?
I mean, that's a lot there. I mean, I guess the principles are there, but if I understand you right, this sort of idea that when we encounter a building or anything really, we're projecting it's not just our visual interpretation of it, we're projecting all kinds of associations and historical context. And of course, this has current resonance and relevance now because of how people are interpreting statues all over, certainly the UK and the USA. Does the context matter? How to make the context salient? How to make the context visible? And I think there are all sorts of interesting ways that one might approach that. But Yeah, I mean, you're right. It makes sense that that's how we interpret buildings. A colleague of mine, Paul Verschure, he did a project in part of a European project I was involved with, where he works with Bergen-Belsen, former concentration camp. People still visit these places, but there's not much there anymore. You know, apparently I've not been, but you know, there's an information center and some stuff, but they're quite objectively pleasant environments. You know, you have nice fields and woods and things. And there's a dissonance between the message that these visits are trying to convey and the immediate reality of these places. So he was using, again, virtual reality, so people would walk around and the buildings of the time would emerge. So you'd have this idea of bringing the past back to the present experience. Quite how this process works in terms of brain dynamics and interactions is out of my wheelhouse. I think it's very, very hard because, you know, in the lab we can manipulate certain things. You know, where light comes from, have you seen this image before? But because these associations are so distant in space and time and individually variable, it becomes pretty speculative when we start thinking about the specific neural basis. But sure, it makes sense to think that way.
I think one question I have is the difference between intelligence and learning. And I think, Refik, your project is definitely intelligent, and the variety of possibilities that is emerging from your algorithms is incredible. And you mentioned at one point that it was learning, and the question that I had was, what is it learning, and how do you determine how do you value what it's learned, and was it successful or not? And that's sort of a difference between generative possibilities versus very specific goals and purpose.
It's an incredible question, and I think that's overall, like, as a studio is an ecosystem, right? We have an anthropologist, AI engineer, data scientist, neuroscientist, architect, designers, like storytellers. Like, we are actually just like not, let's say, I think what I'm finding is it's more started as speculation of like learning itself is, I mean, at least we learn the moment of remembering and we are now understanding the moment of hallucinating in the context of a machine. But what I'm still very much researching is the moment of learning. Like, I think so I grew up with a family surrounded by teachers. So I think it was a very natural thing that I learned to learn when I was very, I think, young. But I think what really strikes me is the process of learning. Like, what I think I'm just looking for analogies and distances and compare and contrast. I mean, as we discussed, like, latent space is a concept as a manifold space. Like, first of all, how do we know what we learn, like how much, right? How do we know we exactly know everything about that specific keyword, concept, or context? I mean, there's already very ambiguity exists question, right? But I think for machine, there's an absolute start point mathematically, at least. Like, we can define much concrete reasons of learning. We can say, I mean, this dimension is locked down, at least its own property. Like, we are creating this conditional environment for the experiment, I feel sometimes. Another thing is, I feel like the experience of learning is becoming a performance. So it's not like just, you know, speculating an fMRI, MRI, or just some, you know, physiological changes in our body, but it's about a machine goes to a space, for example, a library, and you step in the same room while that machine is speculating dimensions, trying to find connections with certain image recognition algorithms, and it just defines some reasons. It puts it there, it puts it there, but it's like us, like we go to a library, we get some books, we get some amazing papers and put them on our desk or in our minds. We are constructing our own library in our own consciousness, right? So I think when we talk about architecting perception includes learning, we are kind of getting inspired by machine right now. Because as humanity, we have models of learning. Academia is built on that, right? But can we learn better? Like, can we remember better? Eventually, can we dream better? Like it's basically expanding the power of the mind moment happening once we, I think, apply an AI next to you, like going, I mean, I'm not trying to say very dystopian. I'm very optimistic in the field. And I think for me, the story finished very positive, not like Elon Muskish, like these dark dreams. But I feel like when AI becomes a pen or, I mean, whatever, a space, a library in near future, that you got this room, like like our boring AC materials, just to say, all right, I'm stepping inside this space, and this, please remember with me, like learn with me, or like I want you to dream tonight a little bit less, or don't remember anything, this will be a heavy day for me. Like, these are not anymore too much speculation, right? I mean, we can define these rules simply and embed this to like a concrete tado ando nothingness, and just apply this context with light in just probably a couple of months or maybe a year. So, and in that room, if that library exists in Zaha Hadid's building, or like, I mean, Gary's, like, whoever designs this, then I think learning becomes the experience. And it's different than designing a library, because we don't have any more shelves, or we don't have any more just servers. Like, we have the experience of learning applied to the consciousness of the space. So there, I think I can't explain what is learning, but I think we can architect the moment of learning if we have the machine intelligence next to us.
Anil, can I just step in and change the subject slightly, but pick up on something that you were, or trying to extrapolate something from what you were saying? The idea that perception is predictive, that it's basically creative in itself, does, in terms of, because I'm interested in the concept of creativity, and obviously your colleague Margaret Bowden is the most famous for talking about creativity in AI out there. But could we not start to reevaluate what is creativity once we begin to associate it with perception? If perception is creative, does that mean that creativity is somehow perceptual?
To some extent, and this may, there may be echoes here with what I gather is the sort of common practice among artists and things. So to learn to be creative is to learn to perceive things differently as well. It's not just to be able to build things differently. I mean, I remember reading, John Berger's Ways of Seeing, and there's lots of treatments about, they all talk about how we see. And of course, this goes back to the beholder's share too. We see just the early impressionist art, which I'm still just, I think is wonderful, is a sort of reverse engineering of the visual system to paint the inputs rather than the outputs. So there's a very tight relationship, I think, between creativity and perception here. The tricky thing is to define what creative really means and how it's to be evaluated. And you mentioned Maggie Bowden's work, and indeed this is absolutely foundational. And I think since the earliest days of AI, people recognized the potential for AI to augment human creativity. But immediately questions were also raised about whether it could be said in any reasonable way that the AI, the algorithm, whatever it was itself the locus of creativity, or whether it was just playing out processes that had been put into it by a human mind. And I think this is a very interesting question, because it just leads us to try to say something more systematic about why we associate naturally creativity with a biological brain, with a human mind, rather than with something else. Could it not be something that could be certainly in partnership with, but maybe even entirely outsourced to something else? And especially in the visual arts, lots of old work about algorithms generating pictures, and now this has really taken off. Right? I mean, I think wasn't it the other week that this AI generated artwork sold for millions and millions of dollars, like broke some huge record, which tells us more about the art market, I think, rather than the philosophy of creativity. There is that, to me, there's no good answer. I mean, I've spent my career thinking mainly about consciousness, which is hard enough to define, and people get into all sorts of arguments about what consciousness means. One of the only other terms that I've found even harder to get people to agree on what it means is creativity. Partly because when it comes to consciousness, and you have a toothache, you're having a conscious experience, right? That's going on. You go under anesthesia, it goes away. That's going on. Nobody can even agree about what, where creativity resides in our argument. What's creative for somebody is just isn't for somebody else. The phenomenology of it is also quite, it's difficult to pin down. It's very elusive. Sometimes it's only apparent in retrospect. So I tend to sidestep some of these questions about whether something can be thought of as truly creative, just to think, well, does creativity as a whole, is that augmented, is that benefited, is there a partnership? So certainly modern AI things, I think, really can catalyze creative outputs in exactly the way that Refik has beautifully illustrated in all this stuff. There's no way you can do that without, you know, I think it's a true partnership as well, which is not to downplay your input into it, Refik, but the whole depends, you know, on both. And whether that leads us to, in the end, think differently about creativity remains to be seen. Maggie Bowden, she distinguished, I think, I can't remember now, but certainly there was one form of creativity which she defined as that which is only evident in hindsight. Mm. Another form was the sort of historical form where you're the first to do it. So you could be, for instance, somebody could have written you know, yesterday, 10 years after Lennon and McCartney, but they did it first. So they were the creative one, but presumably the experience would have been the same for both. So it's, yes, it's a bit of a minefield, but it's certainly exciting to see how these different disciplines can augment creativity as it's unfolding today.
Can I just pick on that, the creativity and consciousness? I mean, there's one of the arguments made about why AI can't be creative is not that it can't produce novel outcomes. It's that it's not aware that it's doing it. In other words, to be able to be, I think Melanie Mitchell's the person who says this, in order to be creative, you've got to know that you've been creative. So that kind of implies that you have to have consciousness to some extent of what you're doing. The question I have, though, is whether some of these things that appear to us in maybe, I don't know, flashes of imagination or something, or dreams or hallucinations, whether they're actually conscious in themselves, whether they're just not erupting out of ourselves in some way, and then we are evaluating them and appreciating them and selecting them and saying that was interesting and so on. So, because I guess I'm thinking, because that's what's in a sense happening is this kind of like, in Andy Clark's terms, this kind of, you know, cyborg-like existence, whereby it becomes this prosthesis. And one of the comments that I came across in my research on AI was a guy called Michael Hansmeyer, who talks about AI as being like a muse. You know, we have our own biases, and AI opens up other possibilities, and suddenly you see them and you appropriate them in some ways, and it becomes something that expands the imagination, but we're the ones who appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think every technology can be thought of that way. The pen is a muse as well. We can write stuff down and read it back, and that augments our ability to form stories creatively. I find the sort of the Melanie Mitchell argument a little bit unsatisfying. You know, okay, so you need to be conscious to know that you've been creative, but to me that doesn't really explain anything significant about the act of creativity itself. It's one of the complex problems about creativity that it's partly defined in how it's evaluated. And you know, and on the other hand, yeah, sure, there are all these you know, conscious experience that we have is rise on top of a vast network of interactions unfolding in our brains, many of which do not directly shape our conscious experience at any given time. And one of the day-to-day kind of experimental things we can do is try to distinguish conscious from unconscious perception, what kinds of things we need to be aware of in order to do. And even our conscious perception in the here and now is built on a lot of processing that is fundamentally unconscious. We're not aware of the mechanisms that give rise to our experience. We're only aware of the result of their operation. And quite what unconscious processes lead to creative outputs is a hugely interesting question, especially when it comes to things like sleep. There's all these stories, these anecdotal stories of the benzene ring joining up and ideas that came to people during sleep. Of course, a whole lot of waking experience was necessary before that, both to allow that dream to happen and for it to be recognized as is important later on. But it's not just dreaming. So in that context, there's a lot of interesting ideas about what happens in non-dreaming stages of sleep as well. And so one of the interesting ideas here is that during our waking state, we're perceiving things all the time. So our generative models that we use to form these perceptions are being augmented during the day. Put it very crudely, synapses are being strengthened more or less during the day. If this continued to happen all the time without any change, our brains would not be able to hold any of this stuff, and that would be cluttered with useless associations as well. So when we sleep in these non-dreaming states, the brain is characterized often by these very slow oscillations of electrical activity. And one of the potential things this does to the brain is it just lowers the overall level of connectivity between different regions and different brain cells. So I like to think of it as, during the day, all these like mountains or icebergs emerge from the ocean, and you get this landscape. And then during non-slow wave sleep, the whole landscape, or the sea level rises, and so only the peaks remain. So it's a sort of homeostasis, normalization of what happens. And what that leads to in an algorithmic sense is that you're reducing the complexity of your generative models. You're less likely to overfit the data. And these people, everybody, including all the panelists here working in AI, we know that if it's always this fine balance between being able to predict the data and overfitting to the data that you have. If you overfit, you don't generalize. And you need to be able to generalize from the data that you've trained on if you're going to do anything useful with machine learning and AI. And so the idea is that sleep is reducing the model complexity so that it generalizes better. So that we wouldn't be able to, so it's part of learning to perceive better the next day.
But by the way, so interesting. I was just checking the data of like where the ideas, I think it's a very common question, right? Where the ideas comes from, where do they go? But what was very funny is many of my friends and colleagues who are like creating creative ideas, let's say, in their life, they most say that daydreaming is their state of like when the imagination really functionally helps them to really believe what they think is worth to like go for it. Like that kind of feeling like, okay, I'm daydreaming right now. I'm in a state of like consciousness, control the environment, music, whatever the taste of daydreaming. But most creative minds really thinks that, all right, that's it. I'm holding this idea. That's most likely what I should do, and then go for it. Very interestingly, many creative minds also, I don't know, like the state of dreaming or a more unconscious state, let's say, for some people. It's very interesting. Like for machine, there is no sleep, right? Like there is no, like it doesn't forget. It's a very like a challenging concept, like a machine that doesn't concept, a system that we cannot close versus a human that has a disease. We will eventually fade out in the physical world that we are in, but a machine, if it has its own certain CPU, GPU, whatever, the water and the cooling and the power, it doesn't close, it doesn't forget. I think conceptually, when we start like comparing and contrasting human versus machines, there is a big disadvantage for us there, like, or maybe advantage for us there, but I'm really getting more like thinking like, wow, when we are awake, we are daydreaming, a machine that doesn't close, then it's really hard to like, compare contrast the systems. It's great for speculating and really analogically grounding the ideas, but sometimes suddenly, it doesn't forget.
Some machine learning algorithms, they do have a sleep stage. One of the very famous ones is the wake sleep algorithm, which works on exactly these sorts of principles, that sleeping is a very, very important part of how that algorithm works in order so that it generalizes better. So it seems that you can have sleeping machines. What you don't have is this tight connection to the physiology, and to me this is always the big difference between AI and us. We aren't just intelligent, even if we are. Whatever intelligence we have, fundamentally we're living creatures, and all of our perceptions and all of our cognitive abilities, I think, trace down to the evolutionary purpose of a brain, which is to keep the body alive, and therefore keep itself going, to make sure the cells have enough oxygen to keep turning over. And this is why, for me anyway, I think there's the gulf between the machine and the artificial and us needs to confront this fundamental difference between the living and the non-living. You're not going to get, certainly I don't think you're going to get conscious machines until you have living machines.
They're thinking of, you know, the projects of creating neuromorphic computing, where it's reaching more towards bringing, let's say, energy impulses in a different way in a hardware system that sort of mimics the human brain, where these neurons, digital neurons, are throwing some kind of energy or chemical impulses. And I do think that the neural networks, which is software-based, computational-based, bringing on the neuromorphic computing models of the hardware can lead more towards a coming together of human and machine intelligence. What I find fascinating about all of these conversations is that I think neuroscience and architecture, since I've been working on that for a while, there's a really interesting way to use these two disciplines coming together and using neuroscience in a variety of ways. And what I've learned is neuroscientists are looking for problems to solve. And so what Refik is doing is using neuroscience and architecture in a very generative way. And many of the scientists and architects use neuroscience and architecture as an analytical device to see how navigation is more efficient or not, and how light may be affecting our biosystems. And then there's the other way where I think in this kind of conversation where neuroscience and architecture can bring new conceptual models and thinking models in both disciplines, which is so exciting. And Digital Futures and what Neil is doing is bringing these kind of people together, is opening up that speculation and possibilities of bringing these biosciences and hard sciences, computational sciences together. Fascinating.
Thank you all together.
Yeah, can I just maybe we should wrap this up soon, but finally ask Anil, I mean, what's interesting about your background, and there are many others who've done similar things, is you've got combined neuroscience with AI. You did your PhD on AI, and then now working as a neuroscientist. And there are, I think Geoffrey Hinton, did a PhD on neuroscience before going into AI. And there are many examples of this kind of approach in some sort of ways. And I almost feel that whether you're doing AI or neuroscience, the key question is, you're just interested in intelligence itself. That's the problem you're trying to get at. So I wanted to ask you just a general sort of question. I mean, one of the kind of perplexing things is that, we have this, the neural network, which is kind of modeled loosely on the brain. I mean, so loosely that Melanie Mitchell doesn't want to use the word neurons. She uses the word units because it's so different. And yet it seems that connectionist AI, which is the kind of become to the fore now, which is modeled on the brain, seems to be the most powerful sort of tool at the moment. The trouble is that we don't know how the brain works, and we don't know how deep learning works. It's all a kind of a mystery in some sort of way. But the question I wanted to put to you is to what extent can AI become a mirror in which we can recognize what human intelligence is and what it is to be human?
That's a beautiful question. But I also just want to say, Kris, I thought you put that beautifully as well in terms of the interaction between these different ways of thinking. I mean, ultimately, whether you're doing neuroscience or architecture, from this perspective, we're fundamentally interested in the human condition and the nature of it and the things that affect it. And there the disciplinary boundaries break down, I think. So rather than this sort of functional perspective of how do we design this building so that our circadian rhythms, we get less jet lag and so on. Also interesting, but not the same. Yeah, I mean, Neil, that's a fantastic question. You're absolutely right that this sort of, the term neural network, I think, overplays a little bit the similarity between brains and these systems. Of course, a neural network runs on a von Neumann machine. It runs on a serial processor. Neuromorphic hardware is beginning to change that, Kris, as you rightly pointed out. The key innovation, I think, in the connectionist thing is, of course, everything is distributed. And that was evident from the 1980s, that you have these distributed processing, distributed representations that seem to capture much more about how biological systems learn too. And then the advent of deep learning, which historically traces way back, but has taken off in the last 10, 15 years, because of GPUs and big data and all this stuff. It's good, but it's still only good at particular things. And so perhaps one way to think of it is that AI and the study of intelligence or cognition generally is a moving target. And as soon as we can get a machine to do it, we no longer call it intelligent. It's just what the system that we know, especially when we understand how it does it. Then that's what that does. And real intelligence then resides somewhere else. The way and that will change how we see ourselves, because we'll always be trying to relocate ourselves. I think as humans, we have this tendency to want to see ourselves as special and as different and as the smartest and the best and the center of everything. So we'll keep trying to find that portion of our ability and our insights or our behavior or our experience that cannot be reproduced in a machine. This may be a good thing because we might pay more attention to ultimately things that really matter about our life, the emotional experiences that we have, our nature as living systems as part of a biological ecosystem. But it also means we keep reducing the space of things that we think of as distinctive too. To me, that's not a bad thing. We were at the center of the universe, we're not. We were supposed to be different biologically from all other creatures, we're not. And the more we can naturalize our intelligence, and our cognition and our perception, I think the closer we can see ourselves as part of nature. And for me, the ideal outcome would be the mirror. If AI or whatever tool we have, if that mirror helps us see ourselves as more continuous with nature, then I think that's going to be a benefit all around.
So maybe could one even say that one of the roles of AI is to make humans be more human?
Maybe, and I think science fiction has dealt with this much better than any scientist. I mean, so I still, as Refik meant, it was great to see Blade Runner. I absolutely loved that as a kid as well. And it was astonishing that 2019 was last year. And when I saw Blade Runner, it was like, wow, that's far away. The future really is going to be like that. And no, it wasn't quite like that. Where are the flying cars? But this question of what it means to be us, science fiction has dealt with this, and the implications of AI for this. Science fiction has always posed these questions in a more immediate and salient way. So going back to 2001 and how through Blade Runner, and I think most recently for me, ending up with Alex Garland's Ex Machina.
Yes.
Which just hits the nail right on the head there. We just gloss over the single conceit about how you build a robot like Ava that is indistinguishable from a conscious human being, and it recreates this Turing test. The Turing test, of course, was originally a test of how would you tell if a computer is intelligent? Well, it's when you can't distinguish the computer from a human being, and it reinvents that test as a test of consciousness. How would you test whether the machine is conscious? Well, can you tell the difference between that and a human being? And it's actually one of the few examples that's now become known as the Garland test, and is part of some philosophy courses on philosophy of mind and philosophy of consciousness. So yeah, I mean, the creative arts, be it architecture, art, filmmaking, they're ahead of the game in addressing these serious questions, and it gives me an excuse to watch these films all the time, because I think I can therefore be a more informed scientist.
But by the way, just maybe timely to also say, we are speculating this concept of latent cinema, the idea of cinema is based on a very linear experience designed non-linearly, but at the end, the audience are expected to be start and finish a journey, at least in a given time and space. But in latent cinema, maybe the idea is what will happen if you have this chance of creativity of non-linearly a machine that constructs these realities, but that reality doesn't have this conventional jump cuts, this cross dissolves, or things that we know from the traditional cinema. But what will happen without viewing and VR or AR? Still go back to the same state of tectonic space, or maybe immersive environment in an architectural space. But there you have this context of cinema, meaning unfolding a narrative, but completely in a different way. So I feel sci-fi, imagination or academic imagination, in general, I think imagination applied to the model of machine intelligence and applied to the other fields easily reinvents, I think, not invent, reinvents the concept that is already there. So, I mean, it won't be too hard to say that one day a machine can construct a narrative that is constantly based on that specific person's memories, and eventually may even generate dreams or hallucinations, that you may even become a part of this journey by yourself, by putting a coin or like, you know, the very, I mean, ancient way of like looking arcade games, but arcade dreams are not too like, you know, hard to speculate once you have all these items in one place constructed purposefully, right? Anyway, it's so inspiring to like think together. It just loudly sharing.
Can I just throw in one thought about, I think Blade Runner, that's inspired me a lot as well. But there's something else about Blade Runner which is kind of a little bit uncanny. We're used to sort of thinking about how this whole pandemic was predicted by contagion. But actually, if you think about when Blade Runner was set, it was set, I think, the 19th of November to 21st of November, and that's why Elon Musk launched his Cybertruck on 21st of November. Well, do you know what happened on the 17th of November? On the 17th of November was when they discovered COVID-19 or coronavirus when it was then. And the parallels are kind of astonishing because just as the replicants can kind of work their way through society undetected because they look so similar to human beings, so the virus itself is completely invisible and works its way through. And with both, of course, you have to have this elaborate testing process to go and find out what whether it's there or not. So there are all sorts of really interesting kind of observations there. It's a very inspirational sort of movie in many ways. Do we have any final questions at this point? Or I think one thing that I want to say, this is actually, you have these ideas about setting up this thing, this whole event, Digital Futures World, was almost like a sort of a conversation in a pub, and it's become a reality. One of the things I thought would be really interesting is how you could bring people together across the globe into a conversation, one-on-one. And I think that's, in a way, what we've managed to achieve today, not just physically, geographically, from Brighton to LA to Fort Lauderdale and so on, but actually in terms of the subject matter. I think there's a really interesting bridge that has been built here, or at least the beginnings of a bridge. And I really hope that we'll be able to kind of develop this further in the future. And I think maybe Kris, his work in ANFA is precisely about making these bridges. We can begin to see that they can continue. I think Refik's bridge is already with architecture itself and with AI and with media art and so on. And I think it's what's happening is we're getting into a really interesting kind of moment in terms of kind of philosophical, theoretical, neuroscientific debates when the creative world of art, media art and architecture are coming together, and we're able to reconfigure things in a fascinating new way. So I would just like to finish by thanking our panelists. I'd like to thank Daniel Bolojan, who's really one of the great AI people in architecture, Kris Moon for her insights from a neuroscientific architectural point of view. Anil, Seth, I mean, I've got to say that I can see why you've got 10 million hits on your TED Talk. It's absolutely fascinating, this work. It's opening up, I think, whole new world ahead of us. And Refik Anadol, whose work, I mean, it's absolutely astonishing. I mean, it's exquisitely beautiful work, but then the connection with neuroscience is something that I think is absolutely intriguing. So let's hope that this is not the end of the conversation, but the beginning of a longer conversation. And I'd like to thank you all for taking your time today and be involved in this. This has really been for me very special, and I hope that you've enjoyed it as much as I have. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you,
Neil.
Thank you.
Thank you, Refik. Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you, everybody. Super nice to meet you all.